everyone, and welcome to today's Connection Group lesson. We are so thankful that you've tuned in and you're experiencing this lesson with us, and we're excited for the opportunity to study God's Word together, continuing during this time where things are not normal, but having the opportunity to continue to be built up as a church. And so, James, you doing good?
Yeah, man, I'm great, man. I'm just great to be right here.
We're kind of back in the same room. We're still social distancing.
Absolutely, man.
Apart, but we are back together in the same room, and we want to encourage you guys to make sure that you're still connecting, like we said already, with other people, and whether that's through Zoom with your groups or whether that's through just a text message or a conversation on a telephone, somehow, some way, reach out to those around you to continue to grow together as our connection groups. And so, James, before we get started for a minute, let us know about this resource that will be available next Sunday.
Yes, this is our member resource, which is originally the DDG Guide, or the Daily Discipleship Guide. What we're doing, we put that together for you guys because we start a new curriculum on the 7th of June. And so I know with what we're going through right now in the pandemic and the coronavirus and we having to be distant and so forth, what I'm going to do is provide a weekly DDG guide for you guys. And you can access that May 31st here in our foyer of the worship center and whatnot. Or you can come by, pick it up. I have some available like that. Or you can get it offline off our webpage or off of our Facebook page. So those different opportunities where you can get it and be able to go through the week with it and then tune into us and then also talk amongst your classes.
Yeah, great. And so it's an awesome resource for all of us to utilize in preparation for the week's lesson that we'll have. And so we'd encourage you guys to check that out. And so, James, today we're teaching and talking about Unit 12, Session 4. If you have your Bibles, we encourage you to open them to 1 Kings chapter 11. We'll start there. But we're talking through this lesson entitled A Son Rejects Wisdom. A Son Rejects Wisdom. The main point and main idea for this is sin against God has consequences that may impact others. And the student main point, James, says this: half-hearted devotion leads to foolish choices. And so we kind of get to this point in Solomon's life that we'll talk about in a minute, that obviously some consequences come and some sin enters into this situation and just kind of what all that means. But as we begin this lesson today, James, there's a story in the student guide that talks about really a situation in our history that's not, it wasn't a great day, and that happened on January in 1986, and it was the day that the space shuttle Challenger lifted off from its this landing there in Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral to begin its 10th mission. And on board there was a school teacher named Krista McAuliffe, and her status as the first teacher in space ensured millions of school children that were tuned into the watch that day that they could just experience that together. And then 73 seconds, James, into the mission, the Challenger, though, exploded in a horrifying plume of smoke and fire. The story says the investigation into the disaster determined that the explosion was caused by failure of a rubber gasket and O-ring that had become brittle and stiff due to cold temperatures. It's hard to believe that a failure of such a small ring of rubber could have such catastrophic consequences, the lesson talks about right here. And then it says this: what is even more tragic is that engineers were aware of the possibility of the failure based on the data from previous shuttle missions. Tragically, warnings were unheeded and the shuttle blew apart. And so today, as we think of this story, and specifically the story of Solomon, it's another story. The story of Solomon is another story, James, of warnings that were ignored, leading to tragic consequences. Just as the integrity of the O-ring was compromised by the cold temperatures, Solomon's coldness towards God commands compromise his devotion. Toward God's commands compromise his devotion. And here's as we just kind of begin all of this, what may have appeared to be rather benign or slight problems would rather be revealed to be fatal. Through the foolish choices of his son Rehoboam, the fullness of Solomon's folly was exposed and the kingdom was torn apart.
Man, I was 8 years old.
8 years old.
8 years old, man.
1986.
That's right, 86. 8 years old.
I was not born yet, James.
Okay.
So, anyways, James, we're in this conversation today, thinking about sin, thinking of obviously the negative consequences that come into that for us, but also other lives. And so, start us today as we think about this 1 Kings chapter 11.
Yeah, last week we talked about Solomon and him building the temple, and how beautiful it was, and how even in his benediction, in his prayer, he was dedicating it, and you just seen. Obviously, the heart, at the beginning, this God, please, basically bless it and bless the people, and and things of that nature. But so after that, he began to gain riches and wealth and all these different things, and something went wrong. And this is where we're at in chapter 11 of 1 Kings. And my title here has Solomon Turns from the Lord in my Bible. And so let's read verses 1 through 8. Yes, 1 through 8. Now I stop periodically because there's some things I want to make mention of. It says, "Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women." It says, in verse 2, it says, "From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love." It's interesting, you see these foreign women, the Moabites and Israelites, they were often in conflict together. And at different times in history, you see Israel ruled over the territory of Moab. As a matter of fact, Ruth was a Moabite, and so forth. But these people were related to the people of Israel, but were the descendants of the incestuous relationship between Lot and his elder daughter. And this is how the Moabites came to be. When you're looking at the Ammonite people, they were the product of Lot again, and they were often in conflict, obviously with the Israelites. And Solomon's son Rehoboam, his mother was an Ammonite. And so, and then obviously the Edomites, they were people who lived in the rugged mountainous areas and so forth, kind of southeast of the Dead Sea, but they were the descendants of Esau. And so, so there's history there. Right. And so you get there, and then you see this word in the first in verse 2, and it says, verse 2, and it says that he clung. Says, or what your Bible says there in verse 2? It says Solomon clung to these in love. I have the NASB.
Mine says that to those women, Solomon was deeply attached in love.
Yeah. See, and it's interesting because that word in Hebrew, it's clean, stick, hold, hang on. Right. It's like, when I'm playing with my boys and my boy comes and he tries to hang on to my leg and, and stuff, won't let me off. I'm like, get off my leg, But it's like to cleave to it. When you hear that word, you naturally think of Genesis, where man leaves his woman, cleaves, and so forth. But this does not necessarily have the context of intimate relationship between a husband and a wife. We see this same verbiage used in the book of Ruth. In the book of Ruth, we see Naomi's husband and her two sons, they died. They're gone. And she tells both of her daughter-in-laws, she tells them to go and to return to their mother's house. This encompassed their Moabite gods as well. Right. I mean, it's go back to your culture, go. Matter of fact, she said, go back to your gods too. Mm-hmm. And make long story short, Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah, ended up kissing Naomi, and she leaves, Right. And but the writer records this. This is interesting. In verses in verse 14 of chapter 1, it says that Ruth, and it says clung to Naomi. It says clung to Naomi. So what does this mean? How does this? How did she cling? Well, Ruth said this. Do not urge me. She said this to Naomi. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge or where you stay at, I'm going to stay at, you know. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything, but death parts me from you. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at giving up of oneself.
Right.
I mean, we're seeing that she gave up, and this is interesting, she gave up her identity. Because if you're looking at the Moabites and she's saying, go back to your home, to her culture, she gave up her identity. She gave up who she was. She gave up herself to the culture of Naomi. And so Solomon, in turns, when you read this, Solomon gave himself up. He gave himself up. He lost his identity.
Yeah.
He gave himself up to the culture of these pagan gods and goddesses. He clung to it. And so we get here in verse 3, it says he had 700 wives. Yeah, that made me choke right there. 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. I mean, these were likely political alliances.
Right.
This is one of the reasons why some people believe that he was very smart or wise because he was able to make alliances with these different countries and so forth and gain wealth and all of that. But these alliances were sealed by marriage. And so the writer quotes, and this wasn't supposed to happen because the writer of Deuteronomy quotes, he says, "You shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away away after their gods." Now, this was obviously in this particular passage, but it's quoting out of Deuteronomy in Exodus 23:31 through 33, chapter 34 and 12 through 16. It is quoting that, and so you see that there. This was not normal. You know what I mean? In a sense of, as far as Yahweh's people, you know, it shouldn't have been normal. Obviously, we've seen through the ages that God even still used people that did, but this dude, he was like, I mean, he was on it, you know, in that sense. And so, as we get to verse 4, it says, "For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." So David, we know he was a man after God's own heart.
Right.
He loved God wholeheartedly, regardless of what he has done and been through. He had a devotion, a loyalty, a hesed toward God.
Right.
And but this particular word, holy, shalim, which is the word in Hebrew in ancient Near East, the root of this word is its basic meaning is peace, you know, shalom.
Right.
However, this term in the noun form is also used as a sacrificial term. And this is interesting to me because when you look at Romans 12:1, and it says, "Present your bodies as a living sacrifice." So when you're looking at this, and you see this, he didn't present himself holy, or his heart was not holy or complete.
Right.
Meaning he lacked wholeness, totality. He was undivided.
Right.
His loyalty was divided. He didn't show hesed toward the true God. And so it goes on in verses 5 through 7, and I'll read those. It says, "For Solomon," verse 5 says, "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord." There it goes again. "As David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place of Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites on the mountain east of Jerusalem." And so Solomon reintroduced Canaanite values to the people. The writer used what is known as a Hebrew idiom, which is he went after. He went after. A Hebrew idiom is an expression that means something different than what it actually says. For example, he kicked the bucket. It means he died.
Right.
I mean, so that's one of the idioms. And so this right here, when it talks about he went after, went after, this literally means walked after,
right.
serving. And when it is used in reference to other gods, it carries a negative nuance. So some possible translations are bowed down to, adoring in that way. And so Solomon was seeking and giving himself to Ashtoreth, which is a Canaanite goddess. Canaanites use it as Adarat. Babylonians use it as Ishtar, Astarte, the Greek. But it's the goddess of love and war and also fertility. She was worshipped especially at Tyre and Sidon. She is considered the partner of the Canaanite fertility god Baal. Many of us, we say Baal, but it's right. Baal. And so he gave himself to Ashtoreth. He gave himself to Milcom. Milcom was a national god of the Ammonites. Scholars disagree on whether, this is a side note, scholars disagree on whether the deity called Molech in verse 7, as we saw in 2 Kings 23:10 is a different deity or the same deity. Because we know Molech, people sacrifice their kids to Molech.
Right.
So regardless of what one it is, it's still a different god. It's a pagan god, and he has given himself to this god. Komesh was the chief god of the Moabites, and so forth. So it's interesting to see how the degradation of Solomon, how it began, and how it's going down fast.
Right.
And so we get to verse 8. And this is the one I would leave off on, but this is verse 8. Verse 8 says, "And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods." So he made offerings, he sacrificed to their gods. He turned to syncretism. When you're looking at it, Solomon turned his heart, his loyalty to synchronistic worship, in essence, polytheism.
Right.
And so his loyalty to the God of Israel, Yahweh, was turned to his passions, his flesh, basically.
Right.
And so you see this king starts out well, and then he falls down. And all because he turns away his heart from the things of God.
Yeah. And so what we see, James, right here specifically, and first off, I mean, Solomon, known as, one of the wisest or the wisest person ever to live, but making these choices that were foolish and not the ones that God would have him to make. And in those choices, it compromised, as you've talked about so greatly, his devotion to God. And your choices, our choices, impact others. Our choices often, more than we know, these foolish choices that we make have amazing things that we'll talk about in a minute, just as far as consequences. But it's important for all of us to think about the choices that we're making, and that's a great conversation to have at home. Solomon's choices right here led to some specific things and consequences and different things we'll talk about in a second. But in all of that, every choice we make has great impact on our lives, big and small. And so a question for you to be thinking about at home right now specifically, and even maybe talk together as your family or your connection group, is this. Solomon allowed personal relationships in his life to direct his affections away from God. How can we avoid similar outcomes in our own relationships? And so Solomon, right here in this story, we see these relationships that pulled him away from God. How can we avoid similar outcomes in our own relationships? Is just a positive thing to be thinking about right now when it comes to your life and the decisions and choices that you're making.
Can I add
Yeah, go
something?
ahead.
You know, I remember growing up in a Christian home, and obviously, you know, I say this all the time. We all have our own minds,
Right.
you know, and we develop relationships with people that, you know, we might want to feel loved or whatever it may be, and I can, you know, when I look back at my life, I look back and I'm like, man, you know, I have gotten myself into relationships, friends, you know, whatever, you know, and that were not healthy for me,
Right.
you know, but I wanted to fit in. I wanted
Yeah.
to feel loved. You know what I
Right.
mean? I wanted to have
Right.
some type of a sense of purpose in that sense.
Right.
Not knowing that God already had a purpose and a plan for me, I just didn't want to hear it.
Right.
You know, and it's just interesting though. That's a good question to ask.
And so now we transition, looking continually in the story of 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 9 through 13. And so if you'll read along with me on those few verses. 1 Kings 11, verse 9 says this: "The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. He had commanded him about this so that he would not follow other gods, but Solomon did not do what the Lord had commanded. Then the Lord said to Solomon, 'Since you have done this and did not keep my covenant and my statutes which I commanded you, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant.'" Then verse 12, "However, I will not do it during your lifetime for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of your son's hands. Yet I will not tear the entire kingdom away from him. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem that I chose." And so we see right here, James, we've seen these foolish choices that Solomon made. And now we see specific consequences to these choices. And again, Solomon, the wisest man ever possibly to live, makes these foolish choices.
Yeah.
And again, that goes back to help us all see our human condition.
Yeah.
A fallen world that we live in, a fallen man that we are, the sin, we're all dead in our sin, and we have this just natural rebelling in us against God no matter what. And so in all of this, we see again these consequences come. And God says, I'm going to take, he talks about specific things about how the kingdom would be done and all of this stuff would happen now because of Solomon. But what's interesting about this, James, is this to me. All of us, again, understand the reality of consequences to our sin. And that's something important to talk about with your kids and your family, and just can see that, because some folks in the world today, I feel like we have a little misunderstanding of consequences, and we think we just do what we want to do and get by with it.
Absolutely.
But this is a story right here that shows of disobedience to what God's leading us to do. There's still grace, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but in that there's still consequences that will come. But specifically what we see in the midst of the consequences, James, we see the grace and love of God still shown.
Yeah.
And so in the midst of our foolish choices, in the midst of the consequences that come because of those sins, God is still gracious and loving towards his people. And we see that clearly through two specific things that happen right here. God tells Solomon that the kingdom would not be divided until after Solomon's death. And so there's one specific thing right there that you just see God's grace. He could have immediately just said, kingdom's done.
Yeah.
Like, you're done, Solomon.
Deuces. Yeah.
Exactly. But he didn't. He said, after your death, the kingdom would be divided. And then the second one was that kingdom wouldn't be totally taken away from David's house. That there would be a son, it said right there towards the end, that yet I will not tear the entire kingdom, verse 13, away from him. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem that I chose. And so in the midst of our foolish choices and the consequences that would come, we still serve a God of grace and love that's at work for our behalf.
That's right.
And trying to, I believe, James, put things in front of us through his grace and mercy to help us see, man, I'm still here with you.
Yeah.
I still have a plan for you. Yes, you messed up. Yes, you did something against me, but my grace is bigger than that. My blood through my son Jesus covers those sins, and if you'll just turn in a heart of repentance back to me, you can experience this grace and continue to walk in the days ahead where I'm leading you to walk in your being fulfilled. And so just I think it's very important for us to understand the reality of consequences, but also in the midst of our consequences, understand that God is still a God of love and grace, sitting there waiting for us to turn back to Him and be obedient to what He's leading us to do.
Absolutely, that's good. You know, it's interesting, and we'll look at this in this last portion, where we see that he said, "Hey, look, I'm going to strip it, but not from you yet." You know,
Right.
and I wonder how Solomon felt. You
Right,
know, like,
right.
man, I'm jacked up. You
Right.
know, and my son is reaping the consequences of
Right.
my mess up.
Right.
You know,
Right.
but in that, like you
Right.
said, God's grace, man, and mercy.
But you also, it's interesting, it says, he mentions David a couple times.
Yeah,
For the
yeah.
sake of David.
Yeah.
David, yes, we know wasn't perfect, but being the faithful one that he was and the leader in the midst of all that, his faithfulness is still leading to implication right
Yeah.
here in the life of Solomon
Yeah.
and this situation for his family.
That's right. That's good. That's good. All right. So we get into chapter 12, and we're going to look at verses 12 through 17. Before we get there, this is after Solomon's death.
Okay.
And now his son Rehoboam became king. And it's interesting because before his coronation was even completed, the people, they brought a request. They're like, look, hey, king, they brought something to their new king. And it's kind of almost reminiscent of Solomon, you know.
Right.
And when Solomon had that request, and Solomon did right at that time, you know. Solomon had placed a heavy yoke on the people, in because of building of the temple and stuff of that nature, and all the wealth that he gained. He did place a heavy burden on the people, heavy yoke on the people, and would Rehoboth, that's where I live, Rehoboam. Lighten it. Will he lighten this load for the people?
Right.
The new king deliberated for 3 days and then gave his answer. So let's read verses 12 through 17. It says, so Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam. This is interesting. Well, anyway, the third day, as the king said, come to me again the third day. And the king answered the people harshly, and forsaking the counsel that the old men had given him, he spoke to them according to the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Now, this is his own people. This is interesting.
Scorpions.
I know, right?
In Rehoboth.
Yeah, in Rehoboth. Oh man. In verse 15, I told myself I won't say Rehoboth, and I did. It's all good. Verse 15 says, so the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord spoke to Ahijah, the Shilonite, and Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And so Rehoboam, not Rehoboth, but Rehoboam, had no humility.
Right.
He had no humility whatsoever. As he began to rule, his ego trumped his humility.
Yeah.
And so much so that he didn't even seek God's heart. He didn't even seek God's wisdom, but he sought people. In that sense, and rather listening to the sensible, seasoned wisdom from the elders. Now you gotta imagine they've been through this stuff before,
Right.
and so they're giving him some wise counsel. He followed the insensible, brash advice from his peers, or from his boys, I would like to say. And let's face it, Chase. I mean, he already had his mind made up.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems as if he already had his mind made up. He knew what he wanted to do before he even consulted anyone.
Right.
I remember we went through this particular portion as a staff, and we talked about this extensively on this. But we looked at his actions, and if you look at it, it's almost reminiscent of Pharaoh in chapter 5 of Exodus. I mean, he just like, I'm just going to do what I want to do,
Right.
And so I love how the book has the essential doctrine, and it talks about sin's effects in the world. And I want to read this. It says, sin does not only impact our relationship with God, it also it is also the root of our broken relationships with people around us. Human sinfulness is the reason the creation groans in anticipation for redemption and deliverance from its bondage to evil powers. And it goes on and says, sin has infected and redirected the social structures of society, leading to injustice and oppression. The distorting effects of sin are visible all around us. But the good news of the gospel is that the battle against these powers will be won through the work of Christ.
That's good.
Solomon's folly led to Israel's fracture, as the book states. Folly that was echoed in Rehoboam's choice to listen to the wisdom of his peers. Israel's subsequent history would be marked by division, be marked by downfall, dissolution. But on God's timeline, the fall of the earthly kingdom of Israel paved the way for the spiritual restoration of Israel and the coming of the Son of David, the true wisdom of God. And so in 1 Kings 11:39, this is interesting. God said this. He says, I will humble David's descendants because of their unfaithfulness, but not forever.
No.
And then it goes on, one day, Jesus, David's descendant, would humble himself by dying on a cross, going to the cross, dying for us. And for this reason, God will highly exalt him and give him the name that is above every name.
That's good.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's so good. You know, James, when you think of this is a question to be processing at home for you, whether your family again or someone at text right now. I mean, it says Solomon's foolishness blinded him to the long-term effects his sin would have on those around him. Mm-hmm. Why do you think people don't usually consider the negative impact sin can have on those around them? You know, I think this lesson sets up. We don't want to just live in the moment of talking about sin, but I think there's a time and a place where we need to be honest with ourselves, and we need to be honest with those around us, and be just transparent to the level God leads you in that, and say, hey, here's what I'm struggling with, here's what's going on, and this creates an opportunity today, maybe to talk about that with your spouse or someone around you, and just let you really think about this thought of why do people don't usually consider the negative impact of sin and how that affects those around them. And so, but James, as you closed right there so beautifully, a quote that I've read this week that's been so impactful to me is this: Jesus says that there's only one way to develop spiritually, and that is by concentration on God. Do not bother about being of use to others. Believe on me. Pay attention to the source, and out of you will flow rivers of living water. So we think about that thought, that Jesus would bring that hope, and that hope that we have to, yes, we're going to still make some foolish decisions and foolish choices, but the grace and the power we have to overcome those things and to walk in the life that God's leading us to walk in, and He gives us that through His Son, Jesus. And so, James, any last thoughts as we wrap up today?
One thing, we see is the fact that I think self-centeredness is in play. Yeah. And I think that's the motivating factor, because we care about ourselves than we do other people. Right. And I think that is something that we always have to fight and struggle against. Yeah. And so as we wrap up today, just to remind you, this main point for the student lesson was simply this: half-hearted devotion leads to foolish choices. We want to encourage you to have a heart of seeking after the Lord. Really evaluate, is there half-hearted devotion in there? Is that what foolish choices are coming out in my life? And ask the Lord. Say, God, help me. Talk to people around you and say, hey, pray for me, or hey, help hold me accountable in these areas, so that you can walk through life and experience the life that God's leading you to live, and kind of fight these foolish choices and this sin that the enemy tries to tangle you up in. And so thanks, guys, so much for checking out today's lesson, and we want to encourage you to continue to be a part of your groups and talking to each other and connecting with each other. A quick reminder about the resource
that'll be available next Sunday, available for you on Sunday morning, or you can come by the church office and get one as well. Great way to stay in the Word of God. And just as we wrap up, just a reminder of our mission of reaching, building, and connecting. And that's our goal as a church, is to glorify the Lord as we fulfill that mission. And you play a part of that. And we're so thankful for each of you. We love you guys. We're always available if you need anything. Don't hesitate